Right, thanks for hanging around for this extra, I was going to say rant, but more of a discussion, I suppose it is, as well as a rebuttal to my original news piece. And I wonder if I've got you thinking about what would make your fantasy garage. In mind, for the purposes of this test, there's one current model from every major category. Obviously, in my complete fantasy garage, that would need to be more of a hangar really, or a warehouse, and require a pretty substantial lottery win to make happen. There's also those bikes that I've ridden over the years that I would just love to have in a personal collection, and yes, the vast majority of those are Japanese bikes from yesteryear. I'm talking about models like the original 1992 Fireblade. I'd love one of those. It just changed the game so completely, made handling much more important than just power, which is what it felt like superbikes of the time were all about. I'm looking at you, GSXR 1100. I'd quite like one of those things as well, actually. Evil looking they were. And while we're on superbikes, I'd like a 2005 Kawasaki ZX-10R. What a beast! A barely controllable, rude, rabid monster of a stubby little superbike that would wheelie off a shadow in the road, never mind anything approaching a crest, and do it in the gears you thought would be calm, like 4th and 5th. Reminiscing now, but the X-Up FZR 1000 was a bit of a peach as well. I remember it being a sort of gentlemanly superbike, just very good at everything, and consequently possibly missing out a bit on some character to make it truly memorable. Which is a cruel thing to say, because if it had some rubbish brakes or a pogo in rear shock, then I might remember it and more and kind of want one more now. Yeah, sometimes I still manage to surprise myself with the level of stupidity I can attain. Anyway, moving on, we've obviously got other sporting classics in the hangar, like Honda's RC30 and 45. There's Ducati's 888 SP that would be a nice thing to see in the garage every morning, but a bit rough and ready to ride, I would think, if you're used to the civility of a modern big twin from Ducati. And of course, 1994's 916, it goes without saying that there has to be one of those in there. Talking about big V twins and a more realistic modern classic for the garage, you could throw in Honda's SP1, though I never really gelled with that. I did, however, love the feisty TL1000 from Suzuki, so I'd definitely hunt down one of those. I don't know if you'll remember the heyday of the sports bikes in the late 1980s and early 90s, but the Japanese manufacturers all made themselves a fancy version of their 750s, which was the racing capacity for World Superbikes at the time. So you had the RR Kawasaki SP, was it OW01 version of Yamaha's 750? There was Honda's RC45, but being a GSXR 750 fan, I love their SP incarnation of that model. Rare, good looking, a tricked out Gixxer 750, so what's not to like? I'm way down a tangent here, reminiscing about a fantasy classic garage at the moment. Properly sidetracked actually, because I'm an idiot and I'm meant to be talking about my current fantasy garage, aren't I? But while my feeble mind is for some reason flicking through the dusty filing cabinets of bikes I've ridden over the years and is stuck in the cabinet marked sport bikes, I think I would like to have another couple of SP RR models squeezed in there, just for some howling good track day fun with mates. One each of the same manufacturers who made those 750s, but this time they're 400s. Maybe you remember them in the grey importing peak times of the same period, late 80s, early 90s. I'm thinking of in the UK, but it was probably the same thing in many parts of the world. This class pumped the units because they were a relatively affordable initial purchase, but more importantly, hugely affordable to insure, particularly if you were a youngster. They came with trick suspension and brakes, and sure, the power was probably realistically only in the 50s, maybe 60s on the back wheel, but because the low power and high chassis capability was a decent mix, you could really thrash them. I've had some memorable rides on some of those things, mini CBRs and RVF 400s, SP Yamahas and Suzuki 400s and a mad Kawasaki that revved up to, I don't know, about 20,000 or something stupid. And of course, that makes me think, how could I forget to throw in a two-stroke or two? Something like Aprilia's RS250 or Suzuki's RGV. Ah, no. Stop it. Stop the reminiscing. Let me get back to the matter at hand, what I said I was going to talk about, and that's my fantasy garage of current models. I showed them to you very quickly in my earlier rant, but let me add a few classes of bike and a word or two about why I've chosen what I have. Bear in mind, this is just those bikes that have got under my skin, so to speak, and this is definitely not a kind of all-encompassing group test sort of thing where I'm trying to say one bike is definitively better than the others. So working from the smallest capacity up, I think I'll leave off-road bikes because they're only good for putting me in hospital because I can't ride them well enough. Next capacity up, and how things have changed since the exciting days of 250s and 400s, I think I'll choose the new Supersport class. And by that I mean World Supersport's new class rules, just for the sake of argument. And that means not just the 600s, but also the MV Agusta 800, the Ducati Panigale V2 at 900 odd cc, and Triumph 765. For me, it would have to be the MV. It's a really enjoyable sporting weapon on the road, and it's also killer at the track. And it's a howling triple and looks great. The Triumph is also bloody lovely, and so too is the Ducati. But actually, if I was to choose one more bike from this class, it would actually probably be a Japanese bike that's been around so long it merits a place in my fantasy garage of modern classic favourites. I'm talking about the R6. I raced one for a little while in the British Endurance Championship, and our race preparation went as far as fitting badly a race fairing, and even more shoddily, and a race exhaust. And we stuck it on the podium second time out, I think it was, on the overall podium as well, not even the 600 class. Great bike, fantastic handling, screaming engine, and a brilliant gearbox if you forgot about the first to second earthquake of a shift. Right, let's stay with this sort of capacity and go with what seems to be a new and expanding class of racy middleweights that offer proper circuit thrills, if you like, but with a modest power output. I'm talking of stuff like Yamaha's R7 and Aprilia's RS660. I'd take the Aprilia. Same goes for a naked version of these bikes, though. I am fond of Yamaha's NT07 and even Suzuki's old SV650, but not quite fond enough. Same capacity class, but adventure bike, and then I'd stay with Aprilia again, based on what colleagues say, because I haven't ridden it yet, I have to admit. But I wouldn't argue with you for taking the Yamaha, that's for sure. This is probably the closest a Japanese bike would come to getting in my fantasy garage. Then up the capacity a bit, and we can talk about the new middleweights that are pretty much what passed for full-on big bikes in the early 2000s, and that's all those bikes in the 800cc to 1 litre range. Naked, I'd be tempted by a bike I've been talking about in relation to the 1290 Super Duke R recently. It's baby scalpel brother, the 890 Duke R. But since I'm going to choose the Super Duke R Evo for my big sporting super naked, then I think I'll ditch the KTM in favour of the V2 Street Fighter from Ducati. In many ways, I enjoyed this more than the V4, simply because it's more usable. And although it might be a supposed middleweight, I mean, that's just silly. Anyway, it's a supposed middleweight these days. We're talking really about a bike with an almost identical capacity and power output at just over 150 horsepower, as a certain Mr. Fogarty used to win a World Superbike Championship a few years ago. So hardly lacking in the performance department, I'd say. Staying with naked, but away from the outrageous super nakeds, my favourite class of bike, by the way. And before I leave them alone completely, I'd have to cheat, because I'm sidetracked again, and put Aprilia's V420 in the fantasy garage somehow. Yeah, can't leave that out. Anyway, let's move on to the larger capacity naked bikes that aren't playing the barely disguised superbike type of game. Here the Japanese are actually strong with bikes like Suzuki's GSX-S 1000 Honda's neo-retro styled CB1000, Kawasaki Z900 and the RS version of that, and of course Yamaha's MT-09, which I've voted for with money. But you've also got Ducati's Monster, KTM standard Duke 890 at the lower end of the capacity spectrum, but further up the scale in terms of cubes and unfortunately price, there's two bikes from BMW that would get my vote. The 4-cylinder S1000R, perhaps a bit too sporty a comparison, and should be lumped in with the Super Nakeds, but it's surprisingly comfortable and even more surprisingly affordable, almost comparable to the Suzuki if you take it in its most basic form. But for me, I'd go for BMW's R1250R, another great twin-cylinder engine, although in boxer form this time, and comfortable and easygoing enough for daily use while still having a fun-loving side behind its slightly sensible looks. Staying briefly for the final naked category, the more sensible middleweight area where the Japanese are strong once again, I'd take Triumph's Trident. But this is also a class that's not really part of a fantasy garage, is it? Right, let's try and blast through a few more categories, but I think you're getting the idea now about how the European bikes are dominating my wish list. Superbike, that'll be Ducati's V4 Panigale. Maybe even the Superleggera version, since it will only be used once or twice a year when I fly to Mugello for a track day. Big adventure bike, Ducati's V4 Multistrada for me, since I'm more than a bit rubbish off-road and I can use this amazing machine as a sport bike, a sport tourer, a commuter, and some gentle off-roading that won't stress my rubbish off-road riding skills. I mentioned the smaller adventure bikes earlier in Aprilia's Touareg. Well, the bigger 900cc adventure bikes are perhaps the new, super middleweights? Getting silly now with the classifications, isn't it? But BMW, KTM and Triumph are all super strong here. But you know what? I think I'd go with Husqvarna's Norden. Yes, I know it's largely an 890 KTM with a different frock, but I really enjoyed my time with it. Even off-road, I like its looks and it does what I need of an adventure bike while remaining genuinely entertaining down a tarred back road. Sport tourers, KTM's 1290 Super Duke GT. That's an easy one for me. Adventure style touring road bikes. Let's go for BMW's S1000 XR, but I haven't ridden the Pikes Peak edition of the V4 Multi, and I very much want to. Super tourers, or maybe just massive tourers, BMW K1600 GT or GTL, or R1250 RT, with an honourable Japanese mention going to the DCT version of Honda's Goldwing. Neo-retro bikes, which are becoming a thing. MV Agusta Super Veloci, though another bike I haven't ridden, Triumph Speed Triple RR, has got to be worth a look. And then of course there's a bike I already love and know well, and that's Husqvarna's Wittpielen. I'd be happy to have that taking up some space in the garage. Modern classics, that's the realm of Triumph, so maybe a Thruxton R. I was going to say to fill that niche, but I think that may have gone out of production recently, thinking about it. So maybe BMW's R9T, does that count? Or perhaps the Scrambler version. This older version of the Boxster engine has plenty enough performance and really suits these roles, heritage line as BMW calls them. Hooligan bike, think I'll have either the KTM, 690 SMC or Husky 701 SM. Same bike, obviously, and most importantly, the same legend of a single-cylinder engine that is also in the Wittpielen, if you'll remember. Right, that's about it, surely. Well, apart from the one category that the Europeans and the Americans don't play in, and that's the hyper-speed sport type, superbike type thing. Suzuki's Hayabusa, Kawasaki's ZX14 and its H2 obviously. Given what superbikes do these days, these aren't even the fastest bikes anymore, but they are a class of their own, and I can't think of a European or American alternative off the top of my head. So I'll let the Kawasaki H2 into the fantasy garage as the one honorary Japanese representative in this garage of mine. Look, I know this is a silly exercise ultimately, and I know that in a lot of cases you could easily justify choosing a Japanese alternative to some of the bikes I've picked, but as just a quick exercise in aspirational daydreaming, and a lot of bikers surely join me in this kind of lottery-winning fantasy. It is something of a startling realization to look at the finish list and notice the absence of bikes from Japan. I started this waffle, sorry for rattling on so much, but I started this with my overall fantasy hangar that includes much loved bikes from my past, and they are all essentially Japanese. That is one hell of a switch around. It shocks me, it really does, and unless Japan's thinking changes soon, I don't see the situation being remedied in the near future. It's a shame because there's no doubting the brilliance of the engineering coming out of Japan, but some brave corporate souls at the Big Four somehow need to encourage more free, adventurous thinking when it comes to new models, new styling, and planning for the medium to the long term. Feel free, please, to disagree with me completely or even agree just a bit, and let me know in the comments. I've probably forgotten many classes of bike and many great models, but in my defence this was just a quick waffle on my part, designed to get us thinking and talking, not really any kind of definitive list. So, get typing, let those comments roll.